In 1848, a Pennsylvania physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride published a set of architectural specifications for the treatment of mental illness. Not a medical treatise, not a pharmaceutical protocol, an architectural blueprint. Kirkbride argued, with the full backing of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, that the building itself was the cure. That the arrangement of corridors, the angle of sunlight through windows, the graduated wings extending from a central administration block, the placement of patients according to their condition, along a spectrum from most disturbed to nearly recovered, that all of this, working together as a single engineered system, would heal the human mind. Within 40 years, over 70 hospitals had been built to his specifications across the United States and beyond. Structures of extraordinary scale, extraordinary cost, and extraordinary architectural ambition. Buildings that required decades to construct and consumed the budgets of entire state governments. And then, between 1965 and 1980, nearly all of them were closed. Not gradually, not individually, as each facility was assessed and found lacking. All at once, across the entire country, as if a single decision had been transmitted simultaneously to every state legislature in the Republic. The official explanation is deinstitutionalization, a policy shift driven by new pharmaceutical options and a reform movement that identified the large asylums as sites of abuse rather than healing. That explanation has been repeated so consistently across so many decades that almost no one has stopped to ask what was actually inside those buildings that required them to be emptied so completely and so fast. To understand what Kirkbride actually built, you have to start before Kirkbride. You have to start with the tradition he was working inside, even if he never named it openly. The therapeutic use of architecture is not a 19th century invention. The ancient healing temples of the Mediterranean world were constructed according to principles that modern acousticians have spent decades trying to reverse engineer. The theatre at Epidaurus produces acoustic effects that should not be possible given its materials and geometry. Researchers studying it in the late 20th century found that sound travelling from the stage was selectively filtered. Low-frequency noise, the background hum of crowds and wind, was absorbed before reaching the upper tiers, while the higher frequencies of human speech were propagated with extraordinary clarity to every seat in the structure. The limestone seating contains properties that modern acoustic engineers struggle to replicate with contemporary materials. Whoever built that theatre I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Is the precision of his acoustic requirements. Kirkbride specified ceiling heights not on the basis of ventilation calculations alone, but on the basis of what he called the moral effect of space. He specified the radius of corridor curves. He specified window placement according to what he described as the therapeutic quality of light at specific angles during specific portions of the day. He specified the materials of interior wall surfaces with a degree of attention that goes well beyond hygiene or aesthetics. Taken together, these specifications describe a building designed to interact with the electromagnetic and acoustic environment of its occupants in ways that conventional medical theory of the period had no framework to explain. Kirkbride had a framework. He did not publish it in full. The buildings that resulted from his specifications share properties that have been noted and dismissed as coincidental. The central administration block of the Kirkbride plan, placed at the precise geometric center of the structure, sits at the intersection of the building's two primary axes. The wings extending from this central block are arranged in a specific angular relationship to one another that is consistent across all Kirkbride institutions regardless of local terrain. The angle is not arbitrary. It corresponds to a proportion that appears with regularity in structures identified by revisionist architectural researchers as Tartarian in origin, a ratio visible in the floor plans of civic buildings across the Northern Hemisphere that were supposedly designed by unconnected architects in unconnected centuries. The Tartaria hypothesis proposes that the architectural tradition dominant in the 19th century was not an original creation of that century. It was the final expression of a much older global tradition transmitted through institutions and craft guilds that preserved technical knowledge from an earlier civilization. The great public buildings of the 19th century were not designed from scratch by architects working from first principles. They were assembled from a template whose underlying logic was energetic rather than purely aesthetic. The Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, the Buffalo State Asylum designed by H. Richardson. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Custodians across the decades as unusual. Sounds that carry further than the dimensions of the space should allow. Resonance effects at specific frequencies. A quality of stillness in certain rooms that observers describe with terms that recur across independent accounts. The feeling that the space is listening. This last observation matters more than it sounds. The therapeutic architecture Kirkbride was specifying was not passive. It was not simply pleasant rooms with good light. The specifications described an active system, a building that would do something to the people inside it, not through drugs or surgery or behavioral intervention, but through the properties of the constructed environment itself. The healing was supposed to happen because of what the building was, not what the staff did within it. The closure of the Kirkbride system is where the story becomes harder to explain through conventional means. Deinstitutionalization as a policy began with the passage of the Community Mental Health Act in 1963 and accelerated through the late 1960s and 1970s. New antipsychotic medications were supposed to make it possible to manage severe mental illness in community settings rather than long-term residential institutions. A reform movement documented abuses within the asylum system and created political pressure to close the large facilities. States facing fiscal pressure found the combination of reform ideology and pharmaceutical optimism sufficient justification to release patients and shutter facilities. The abuses were real. The medications existed. The fiscal pressures were genuine. But the explanation breaks down when you examine the timeline. Chlorpromazine was introduced in the United States in 1954. The major wave of Kirkbride closures did not begin until the late 1960s, more than a decade later. If the medication was the cause, why the delay? And if the medication was sufficient to enable community treatment, why did the closure of the asylums result documentably in a massive increase in homelessness and incarceration among the mentally ill population? The promise that community mental health centres would replace the asylums was never fulfilled. The patients released from the Kirkbride institutions did not move into well-supported community treatment. They moved onto the streets and into jails. This outcome was predictable, was predicted, and happened anyway. Policies that reliably produce the worst possible outcome for their stated beneficiaries are worth examining for their actual purpose. The actual purpose of deinstitutionalization, from the perspective of the Tartaria framework, was the closure of the buildings. The patients were incidental, the buildings were the target. Consider what was physically done to the Kirkbride institutions after they were closed. Some were demolished immediately, others were allowed to deteriorate through water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycling, biological growth on interior surfaces. These processes, over decades of deliberate neglect, alter the material properties of the walls and ceilings. They change the acoustic characteristics of the spaces. They degrade the specific grades of brick and limestone and iron that Kirkbride's specifications required. They make the buildings expensive to restore, which creates political justification for demolition. The pattern of deliberate neglect, followed by justified demolition, appears with regularity across the Tartarian research literature. The great train stations, the exhibition halls, the civic bathhouses, the public libraries. Neglect, decay, demolition. Or a third option that appears in the Kirkbride case with unusual frequency: conversion to luxury apartments. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts was converted to residential condominiums in 2006. The conversion preserved the exterior facade while gutting the interior entirely. New construction inside the historic shell replaced Kirkbride's specified ceiling heights, wall materials, corridor geometries, and acoustic surfaces with standard residential construction. The building now looks like a Kirkbride asylum from the outside. Inside, it is something else. The properties that made it a Kirkbride building are gone. This is a pattern the Tartaria framework identifies as deliberate hollowing. The exterior is preserved because demolition would attract attention and opposition. The interior is destroyed because the interior is where the functional properties resided. The result is a building that satisfies historic preservationists while eliminating whatever the building was actually doing. The testimony that exists about what the Kirkbride institutions felt like to inhabit is not scientific in any conventional sense. It comes from former patients, from staff who spent decades in those buildings, from the families of both. Its contents cluster around a small number of recurring descriptions. Former patients describe rooms where sleep came differently, deeper, more structured, with a quality they struggle to name. Staff describe certain corridors where agitated patients consistently calmed, not because of anything done to them, but because of where they were. The central halls of multiple Kirkbride institutions are described by independent observers across different decades as producing a specific effect, a quality of attention, of presence, that people reach for analogies to describe and typically land on the same ones. The feeling that the room is aware of you, the feeling that something in the space is engaged with you at a level below what you can hear or name. These descriptions are not proof, they are evidence of a consistent experiential pattern that does not fit the official account of what these buildings were and did. The Kirkbride tradition ended not because it failed, but because something about what it preserved became incompatible with the direction the post-war world was being constructed toward. The pharmaceutical model of mental illness did not simply offer a more effective treatment. It offered a model of the mind as chemistry rather than as relationship. Relationship with space, with sound, with the physical environment at a level that the Tartarian framework understands as the fundamental level at which human consciousness can be influenced and healed. The shift from architecture to chemistry as the primary therapeutic modality is, in the Tartaria reading of history, the same shift that appears across multiple domains simultaneously in the mid-20th century. Natural materials replaced by synthetic ones, civic space replaced by private consumption, buildings designed to do something to the people inside them replaced by buildings designed to contain people efficiently. The Kirkbride closures are not an isolated policy decision. They are one instance of a pattern visible across every domain where the older civilization's knowledge of the relationship between constructed space and human consciousness was still operational. The last Kirkbride institution to fully close its psychiatric operations did so in the early 1990s. The building still stands. Its central block is intact. The wings are deteriorating in the pattern the revisionist literature would predict, not uniformly but specifically, with the greatest damage concentrated in the sections where Kirkbride specifications called for the most acoustically significant construction. The building sits, accumulating the specific kind of damage that changes what it was built to be, while the official record describes it as a tragic example of a good idea that did not survive contact with modern psychiatry. The idea survived. It was ended. There is a difference, and the difference is visible in the precision with which the ending was arranged, the materials that were removed, the properties that were altered, and the silence that now fills spaces where something was once, by every independent account, genuinely working.